Let's roll it back to May 31, 2025. A record crowd packed itself into the Melbourne Rectangular Stadium on Swan Street, located in the hub of the Victorian capital's major sport precinct. Fans had travelled from all across the city to converge on the finale of the 24-25 A-League men's season, as crosstown rivals Melbourne City and Melbourne Victory were set to play in one of the most anticipated A-League grand finals. What unfolded across the 90 minutes was rather unspectacular, with City scoring the game's only goal in the 10th minute via the boots of Israeli import Jonathan Cohen. Despite plenty of possession, Victory were unable to create many chances of note, with City's rock-solid defence proving the difference. So it was a match starved of highlights, but City fans didn't care, and Victory fans would rather forget the game happened altogether. But the atmosphere inside and outside the stadium, well, it was electric if you ask anyone that attended. The crowd of 29,902 was the highest ever at the Swan Street venue since it opened back in 2010. The crowd and active support was something soccer fans should have been proud of. It's what makes our sport different from all the others in Australia. But that wasn't the narrative being pushed by mainstream media. If you didn't engage too much with the match, you might remember the coverage of the game in the media. Well, it wasn't actually the coverage of the game itself. It was more the fans and perceived riots and hooligans outside the stadium.
Angry police have vowed to track down the troublemakers behind the pre-match riot that marred the A-League Grand Final.
Heavily armed police gearing up for battle. Their opponents, soccer fans. Flares becoming missiles. Diners and pub goers getting a front row seat as one man is thrown to the ground and arrested.
We make no apologies for having a very strong police presence.
Well, just under the Swan Street Bridge is where the battleground is. Police have had flares thrown at them and sparklers thrown at them. No one was injured, but we've got the riot squad right in the middle.
Mainstream media was quick to point towards the broken record of flares and hooligan behaviour. There were 11 evictions on the day from the stadium on the night and 2 cautions for trespass. 4 penalty notices for possessing lit fireworks and 1 penalty notice for riotous behaviour were issued. While not defending flares and poor behaviour at the ground, the media and police had been driving the narrative and the scaremongering all week. They were expecting trouble, and if they weren't going to get it, they were going to make trouble. On the day of the game, police treated fans like troublemakers before anything had happened. Police were criticised for being heavy-handed by the fans, who were simply out just enjoying themselves. But this narrative and this negativity towards soccer in Australia is not something new. It's something us fans are all too similar with. Australian rules, cricket or rugby league fans might get into a bit of a biff at the game, but it's not treated the same as if it happened at a soccer game. If it's the AFL or NRL, it might just be 2 blokes having a bit of a biff, having a bit of a laugh, letting off a bit of steam. But if it happens at the soccer, it's riotous behaviour, it's fan hooligans. But was there any coverage of the excellent crowd at the stadium or the match itself? Barely. It didn't fit the narrative. But negative coverage of the sport in Australia is nothing new. Fans are used to it. It's a tale as old as time. But where does it come from, and how long has it been happening for? Well, one might assume it came when the sport came to Australia after World War II, brought by waves of migrants from mainland European countries who had a deep ingrained passion for the sport, which was in conflict with a nation that was uncomfortable with anything different. This assumption that both the negativity and the sport came from when the migrants came to Australia after World War II is actually wrong. Since the 1860s, organised soccer has sought a place in Australian society, only to be rebuffed and rejected as a foreign or even alien game, a threat, sometimes even a menace to Australian identity. Ian Seinson's 2018 book, The Game That Never Happened, has been a great inspiration for this video, and I believe, without it trying not to sound like a bit of an ad, is a must-read for anyone wanting an essential reading of Australian soccer's history. It is painstakingly researched and demonstrates how the world game was not brought by migrants, but had been played alongside Australian rules and rugby union way back to the 19th century. Now, diving into the history of media negativity around soccer, we're going to have a quick history lesson. During the 19th century, multiple different types of football were played in the English public schools, with places like Eton, Rugby and Harrow playing their own code of football. Now, a significant event in the early development of rugby football was the production of a written set of rules by the Rugby School in 1845, followed by Cambridge rules in 1848. The Football Association, which we know today as the governing body of football in England, it was formed in 1863 to codify a set of universal rules, but the decision to ban players kicking opponents' shins, or hacking as it was called at the time, led to a major split in the emergence of the Rugby Football Union in 1871, with the FA's codified rules becoming known as association football or soccer. Now, Australian rules football had its first rules written down in 1859. While the original rules have some similarities today, such as the mark, tripping was allowed and the ball was not allowed to be lifted from the ground by a player's hand. So it definitely had a lot more in common with soccer back then than it does today. From 1850 until about 1870, many reports of football games across the continent and across the colonies were published, in where virtually all that is documented is that goals were scored, either they were mostly kicked, but occasionally taken across the line in or by some sort of scrum or scrimmage. Journalists thought little of the future generations, like you and me, who might read these old articles. Different kinds of football were being played, but usually there is no indication of what kind it was. Take Warrnambool Football Club, for example, an Australian rules club located on the Victorian southwestern coast. It was formed back in 1861, making it one of the country's oldest Australian rules clubs. Evidence suggests that the Warrnambool Football Club was established as an English football club in 1861. While it is an Aussie rules club today, it can't be denied that its origins resemble a game similar to soccer, which would be a fair way to describe the first example of Aussie rules in Melbourne anyway. But why does all this history matter? Well, it shows that a game similar to soccer was around as the early 1860s, being played alongside rugby football and Australian rules football, despite the official laws of the game not being published till 1863, 4 years after Australian rules football. The two sports would have been surprisingly similar back then. It shows that soccer was at the forefront of our sporting history, which will help break down some of the stereotypes we'll cover in the coming decades. Just showing how far back Australian soccer's history goes, we can look back to 1875 when an early match was played in Brisbane. In 1879 in Hobart, there was the members of the Cricketers Club played a scratch match under the association rules. But the first recorded match under the laws of the game was contested between the Wanderers, considered to be the first soccer club in Australia, and the members of the King's School rugby team at Parramatta in 1880. In 1883, the Balgownie Rangers, based in Wollongong, was formed, the oldest still existing club in Australia. Makes it older than the AFL clubs Collingwood and Richmond, and even predates the entire sport of rugby league. So where did this soccer phobia or agenda in mainstream media come from, if soccer has been around for so long? Well, its history has long been forgotten, as Simon has pointed out in his book. Soccer has long been a part of our history from the 1860s and even up to the first Anzacs, where a number of diggers were in fact soccer players. Soccer has long been seen as a foreign sport by the Australian rules-loving southern states, a game that cannot assimilate because of its foreignness or unsuitability. While it's disappointing, it's not a completely surprising opinion, considering Australia's long history of anything different and its xenophobia. But this local and imported divide is not as relevant in Queensland and New South Wales, where the two rugby codes of league and union dominate, where hostility usually focuses on questions of courage, masculinity, and sexuality. Historically, in these states, the World's Games opposition has focused on participants being degenerates, women, weaklings, or homosexuals, as referenced in Johnny Warren's autobiography's title. Now, to have a look at a few examples of soccer phobia by mainstream media, we're going to jump all the way back to 1883. The sport was openly ridiculed by the Melbourne media. It was described as unexciting, degenerate, soft, vaguely ludicrous and awkward, a facilitator of cowardly and unmanly violence, unestablished, not as good as Aussie rules, a decided failure, and peopled by imports. A common theme rifled through the history of commentary towards the sport, despite we have already uncovered that the sport has been around since the early days of football in Australia. Soccer in schools was becoming an issue in South Australia in the early 20th century, with this piece from the Broken Hills Barrier Miner in 1912 saying, "Therefore, be prepared to hear the cry of Australia for Australians shouted aloud from the housetops if an attempt is made to make soccer the national brand of football." The same year, a report of a Western Australian Football League, or the WAFL, noted that a letter from the modern school requesting permission to use Subiaco Oval for soccer was met with derision, laughed at, and ultimately refused. It guided the spite and nasty politics of ground allocations for decades to come in Perth, an issue that was ever present across all Australian states, particularly the southern Australian rules-loving ones. We have here, in only a few examples from over 100 years ago, a rhetoric of militant protectionism against what is seen as a foreign, non-Aussie sport. Not a too surprising attitude from a country that had racial policies in place to restrict and uphold certain values and ways of life. Now, when waves of migrants started coming to Australia after World War II, they started up their own teams, but many weren't too happy. Quoting a Melbourne newspaper article in 1951, "People who come to this country and accept all the advantages should support Australian rules football, instead of furthering their own codes." Another article said there must be a united front from all Australian rules football clubs to halt the soccer movement. In 1953, 3 Adelaide soccer grounds were vandalised with large signs saying amid the wreckage, "Down with the soccer. Play Australian rules, you bastards." Soon after, a stone crashed through the window of a Soccer Mirror's office with a note found wrapped around a stone, quoting, "Stop printing Soccer Mirror or else." The newspaper was ultimately rebadged as Sporting Mirror, and articles on Aussie rules were included for the first time. But all these examples are from 70, almost 80 years ago. Well, what about some examples from today? Well, we can look at more recent examples when Australia was bidding to host the FIFA World Cup, the biggest sporting event in the world. The AFL ran smear campaigns in the media after Football Australia lobbied to get access to the Melbourne Cricket Ground and Docklands Stadium, with the MCG ultimately given approval, but the AFL refusing to hand over Docklands. And what about the old C7 Sport Pay TV service, which was owned and run by 7 Network? While it was wound up in 2002 after 7 years, it was revealed later that C7 purchased the rights to the National Soccer League with the intention of suffocating coverage of the sport to benefit the AFL. Even reports on Channel 9 this year, after a Canterbury Bulldogs win in the NRL against the Parramatta Eels, where fans partied in the streets and did burnouts. Not too dissimilar to how A-League fans might celebrate a win. But compare it to the aforementioned coverage around this year's A-League Men Grand Final in Melbourne by the same news outlet, where fans celebrated in a similar way, but were described as hooligans and rioters. This is what soccer fans in Australia have been putting up for decades, hey, even centuries now. But what is the answer? Perhaps we need more people with football backgrounds working in the media, and especially in the government. It doesn't help that we have lost almost all our dedicated football journalists from mainstream media, left with basically Vince Rigari at the Sydney Morning Herald, Marco Monteverde with News Corp's NCA Newswire, with freelancer Joey Lynch, and George Clark and Anna Harrington from the AAP Newswire. News Corp, the owners of the Daily Telegraph in Sydney and the Herald Sun in Melbourne, no longer have a vested interest in soccer as it once did when the A-League was heavily backed by Foxtel, which was then owned by News Corp. There's no need for it to write positive yarns about the A-League or to cover it in depth. Rather, it can just focus on the negatives or the Socceroos and the Matildas, who are both too big to ignore. We need as a country a huge cultural shift for the media coverage around soccer to change. That concludes today's video. Thanks for once again watching our content. Really appreciate you taking the time to do so. This video took a bit of time to put together, but it was by far quite interesting to research. Please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out here. We're trying to get to 4,000 subs by the end of the year. Also, a big shout out to our channel members, Robert Manzo, Matt Jensen, Sean Harding, Davey Grian. Your support is really much appreciated, and you can also sign up, but don't feel obliged, but you can do sign up and help support us on the channel. See you in the next video.